Welcome to the Stern Innovation Conference. We are so excited to have you here. We have more than 430 people registered for the conference today, and we have a terrific lineup. I first want to say thank you to the Fubon Center for basically sponsoring our center, the Fubon Corporation for sponsoring our center, which enables us to host conferences like this. I also want to say thank you to all of our really amazing speakers that we have lined up today to talk about building innovation portfolios. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how managers decide what innovation projects to pursue, where those ideas come from, how they decide which projects to kill, whether they think about innovation as a portfolio, how they know if it's too big or if the blend is right, and just a lot of stuff that is super valuable if you plan on being involved in innovation in any way, shape, or form in your business. And these days, who doesn't? And right now, I want to take a moment to quickly introduce Callan Anthony, a professor here at Stern, who is an expert in innovation and does lots of cool work in areas like synthesizers. And she's also just a terrific friend. She is going to be moderating our next session, which is on innovation in healthcare. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Callan.
Thanks so much, Melissa, and thank you to everyone who's made time to be here on a Friday. I'm very excited for this upcoming panel and the discussion, and to learn from the experts who we managed to line up. So, as Melissa mentioned, I'm Callan Anthony. I'm an assistant professor here at Stern in the Management and Organizations group. As we know, the theme of this year's conference is building innovation portfolios. And today, our panel on innovation in healthcare could not be more timely, nor more relevant to think through some of these key questions from our conference. So the healthcare industry is facing an exciting yet challenging time of technological change, opportunity, and complexity. And while digital and data-driven opportunities are emerging across many corners of the industry, from care delivery to medical imaging and diagnostics, the industry is also one with considerable regulation and information barriers. For instance, to enable innovation, multiple domains of expertise must be traversed, coordinated, and integrated, including research and practice, as well as expertise about patient care, diagnoses, and of course, technology. So with a plethora of opportunity and limited resources, this all makes decisions around innovation portfolios all the more pressing to examine. So today, we have with us an incredible panel of experts to help us think through some of these opportunities and challenges. So joining us today in alphabetical order are Dr. Aphinyanaphongs. He is the Director of Clinical Predictive Analytics and Assistant Professor in the Center for Health Innovation and Delivery Science at NYU Langone Medical Center. He runs a team of engineers and data scientists whose mission it is to create the revolution of healthcare through artificial intelligence. We also have Dr. Yvonne, who is the Associate Chair for Artificial Intelligence at NYU Langone's Department of Radiology. Dr. Louie herself is a neuroradiologist and leads a pioneering program to leverage machine learning to advance medical imaging science. We have Dr. Devin Mann, who is the Senior Director of Informatics Innovation at NYU Langone. He is also an associate professor in both the Department of Population Health as well as Department of Medicine at NYU Grossman School of Medicine. And Dr. Mann is an internist and has spent nearly 20 years in the digital health space, focusing on digital tools in care delivery redesign. And finally, we have Dr. Oded Nov, who is a professor and department chair of technology management and innovation in the Tandon School of Engineering here at NYU. His research focuses on the future of work, digital health, and human-computer interaction. So welcome. Thank you all so much for being here. This is an incredible group, and I am so excited to hear from you. So thank you again for sharing your time with us. So to get us started, I am curious, what do each of you see as the most exciting areas of innovation in the healthcare field from your position or vantage point? And what do you think makes these areas most promising and exciting?
Well, I can start. Hi, folks. So I think what's most interesting, a lot of the infrastructure and technology around AI, is maturing. And I think one of the most exciting things happening is now, there's actual evidence, right, that people are generating in actual clinical workflows, right, that this AI can make a difference. I think that's one arm, and that difference will eventually end up with, in reimbursements and CPT codes and other things. And I think we've seen this entire story all the way through with diabetic retinopathy. So that was one of the first innovations that came out of AI in healthcare. And the application there was, how can we have scanning laser ophthalmoscopes that read the back of the eye and use AI to determine whether that patient might have a complication from diabetes. And so usually this requires an expert, ophthalmologist to take a look at. But this has gone all the way through the pipeline from research all the way to being embedded in guidelines, finally CPT codes. And as an example, that's actually being adopted worldwide. As you can imagine, there are plenty of use cases when places that don't have ophthalmologists, right, of being able to triage care for these patients to take care of them. And I think seeing that entire pipeline gives us a roadmap and a pathway for any and every AI application that we have, from generating, research to creating evidence that's actually efficacious, getting guidelines approved, getting FDA approval, getting CPT codes, finally, and reimbursement, and finally to widespread adoption.
Can I add to that?
Please.
So perhaps to answer that, I want to give some context on a research project that brought the four of us here on the panel and Batya Weisenfeld from Stern together. And this is a collaborative efforts of the NYU Schools of Medicine, Business and Engineering to understand and design the future of technology in healthcare work. So our focus is workflows, worker roles, and work practices in healthcare. And as part of this project that is supported by the National Science Foundations, we identify opportunities and challenges that technologies, including AI or advanced data analytics and sensors of various types, bring to healthcare work. And one opportunity or challenge that we see is that healthcare workers increasingly become technology and data workers. And an example might be the work that Devin does. We have new home-based devices like blood pressure monitors that are increasingly used for remote patient monitoring. But how this blood pressure data that's taken at home and can be best monitored, how can doctors' offices act on it? All of this is still work in progress. So there are questions like, should a nurse take a look at the data stream first and then escalate it further? Should there be data thresholds that at which point things should be escalated? Can AI support all of this process? And how can clinicians not lose sight of the idiosyncrasies of specific patients? So all of these are open questions and open challenges that really underscore how healthcare work increasingly become data work. And that's something that we're all involved in, and I think will keep being an exciting challenge.
And if I could add to what Oded mentioned, I'm an imager. And so I guess my answer to your question is probably biased, right? Because it's such an open-ended question, like where are the innovation opportunities in healthcare? Hopefully there are many moving forward. Healthcare is challenging, though, as you alluded to, with compliance issues and, important stakeholders like patients, and a system that is very traditional in some ways, right? So all those things make it challenging. But I think it's a really exciting time in healthcare in terms of innovation. And a lot of that is what Oded and Yin mentioned. I think that from my perspective as an imager, it's such complex data. And with the advances that we've seen in computer vision, analyzing images, non-medical images, it's finally kind of coming to fruition that we could use some of these tools and apply them to people's health, caring for people. And I think that beyond seeing quickly or seeing what we already know we can see, I think the challenge going down the line is to see something new in these data, to discover, new patterns that were hard to identify. There's so much, as you mentioned, I'm a neuroradiologist in particular, there's so much we don't know about the brain, right? And that we still can't see. So I hope that's the direction for the future.
I guess it's my turn to weigh in. I feel like I'm cleaning up and I can just take all the threads and put them together. And I'll use a story from this morning as my mother-in-law, who's home with COVID, recovering, and she sent me at least 3 screenshots this morning of her home blood pressure monitor because she wanted to know if she should change her meds, of her home pulse ox, and a couple other devices that I think my sister-in-law had sort of stuffed in her house. And she'd tried to send it to her doctor, couldn't quite get it to there, and sent it to me instead. But speaks to what Oded really and what Ian and Yvonne are talking about. The reality that these new technologies are really changing the way we're doing work in healthcare, whether you're an imager or a patient. And so we, really grew up in a system where healthcare happened in very defined spaces, whether it be a hospital bed or an office. And that's just, those walls are coming down. We just haven't fully figured that out yet. And so if I think about where the innovations really are growing quickly, it's, thinking about both the technologies for sure, but the technologies will continue to get better. There's no doubt about that. But how to do the work of this is really pretty new territory. And how to make it make sense, how to use technology to kind of boost signals and reduce noise, how to get teams to reorganize and be able to manage this data without sort of dumping all the work on other people, which is what often happens, right? We don't create a good system. We just ask the people on either end of that system to kind of work harder to make sense of it. And that's unsustainable. That's sort of where we're at now. And I enjoy working with this crew here to try to sort out what it should be.
Very interesting. I mean, one of the things that I hear cutting across all 4 of your responses is this tension around changing people's practices, not just doctors and experts' practices, but maybe other healthcare workers who have to learn how to use and interpret complex data, to use Oded's words, to become data workers. But this is also requiring maybe some practice change on the side of patients as well, getting comfortable with a change in modality, getting comfortable with new tools. What do you think the biggest challenges are, and for whom, in shifting some of these healthcare practices and shifting this sort of, use and comfort with technology and data work?
So I can try to answer that. I think this idea of the distribution channel, right? So let's say you have a great innovation, right? How do you get people to change their practice or incorporate it into their practice? And what are the right incentives to do that, right? So one is, if there's a billing code for it, right? If there's a CPT code or something that's reimbursed, right? There's obviously a financial incentive and an economic incentive, right? To actually do something and incorporate something into practice. And I think that's borne out, in a lot of the startups, that have formed around diabetic retinopathy, because there is a reimbursement, associated with that. The second is, in the face of not having a reimbursement, unfortunately, it might just have to be like boots on the ground, right? And what I like to think in my mind is, drug products, right? So, physicians don't, in a sense, get kickbacks on drug products, right? We give them because they're the right thing to give, and they give them because, they're warranted for the patients that we see. And well, how do drug companies get physicians to, sort of understand that drug and prescribe it? Well, they have boots on the ground that literally go to places, present, and try to generate evidence, try to generate buzz, help people understand what this is, what this new thing is, and how it works. And I think we're just beginning today, right, in medical education of equipping our physicians for even understanding the language of AI and analytics and these other things. And that's kind of a prerequisite, right? When you go have conversations with a potential, distributor, right, being, a clinician who might actually want to adopt the platform, right, or adopt an AI model, for example, of understanding like what it is. You can't just go in there and start throwing technical terms and then, they say, oh yeah, that sounds great, I'll definitely use it, right? There's another level of sort of baseline knowledge that's necessary to say, yeah, here's why you should use it. Connected to that is, the evidence, right? Good evidence can spur usage, right? And so just like, COVID-19 and, things like Paxlovid and things like, ivermectin and other things, right? Like people don't do things in a sense, oftentimes unless there's a good evidence backing that, yeah, this actually works, right? We should get evidence to do it, right? And clinicians, are supposed to be driven sort of by this evidence-based, reasoning to do that. And so, I think all of this is coming together to think about, okay, what are the right incentives, right, to get people to adopt things? And what we know from the way that information distribution in healthcare is that even though you know the right thing to do, what certain things to do are, right, the actual adoption in actual clinical practice tends to be pretty low, right? And understanding that process and understanding the economics, both socially and financially, I think is the key to understanding, how these things are going to be adopted and how they're going to, sort of distribute throughout the healthcare system.
And I would add to that it's not just the doctors who can be pivotal at that. I mean, the one thing we definitely don't want to do in healthcare innovation is to give doctors more things to do as they interact with patients, because that's just not scalable. So there are two things that are really important here that are not necessarily at the cutting edge of the technology, but are really important in order for technology to be accepted. One is the use of other people in the healthcare ecosystem. So nurses, community health workers, people who can guide patients, who can have more time to spend with the patients to adopt these new technologies. And these might be some of these boots on the ground that Ian referred to. We cannot have doctors do all that. And the other side of it is patients, to empower patients through better user interfaces and better, more friendly technologies to actually do what they are asked to do. So again, if we take this example of blood pressure, we need to make it seamless for patients. And usually the people who need to monitor their blood pressure tend to be older and less technology savvy. So we need to empower them. And again, this is through tools and through less clicks between the patient's data and the doctor's screen. And again, this is where some of these allied health workforce or non-physicians can help a lot. Because without this, we will not have data, and there'll be no use for all the fancy technologies that is developed by these startups.
Maybe I'm going to force Devin to hit cleanup for us again. But I think, your initial question about where along the chain of sort of people is this going to impact the most, right? And really, it's going to be a societal change. I mean, there's so many different types of people involved in healthcare, from technology folks, business people, obviously physicians and patients, and not just patients, but well people, right, who have their routine health to maintain. So I think it's really going to be distributed. It's a real societal change. And unfortunately, Yin mentioned evidence-based, and I saw you kind of maybe, we wish that as scientists, we hope that decisions are made in an evidence-based manner, but we see that that's not always the case, right? And I think, we as scientists I think we focus on the impact and the need, right? That's what's going to drive research and innovation. There's a need for something, and we see real patient impact if we implement, whatever it is. But I would almost turn the question back on you. I know you're moderating the panel, but as a business person, I think there needs to be innovative thinking about what the business models are for this. Obviously, there's a cost, and healthcare is already way too expensive, and and who's going to pay and how, or are there savings in other ways? Time is equity, as Oded mentioned. You can't just expect nurses to check like 1,000 data points instead of one. Anyway, just some thoughts. I don't have the answer, I think. I'll leave Devin to have the answer to everything.
I should have gone first. This is my penance. I mean, honestly, that question, the answer is all part. It's an experience. Here at NYU, we do all our digital technology is driven by experiences. We used to do it by applications, thinking of more of that, like, here's this piece of technology. And then we kind of came to that realization that other industries have for a long time is if you don't view it from stem to stern, from the beginning to the end of the journey, you inevitably end up focusing too much on your section of the journey, and you don't care enough about whatever happens both before and afterwards. And whatever industry you're in, you're calling that the last mile, right? That's the last mile problem. But whose last mile? Everyone's last mile, right? To someone else, that's their last mile. And so that's the problem. And so unfortunately, the people giving us the technologies and tools often are very focused on their section of the miles, which is why teams like this have to come together and say, okay, actually, all the touch points are important, and you have to think holistically, and maybe you can't fix them all at once. But if you don't think about whatever this new thing, you're going to disturb the equilibrium that is here. People say healthcare is broken, but it's at an equilibrium. People are surviving in the roles they're in. And so if you disrupt that, you have to think of all the ripple effects. So the reality is everyone is, involved with every single thing like this. And there's just no other way to do it without having that kind of larger map, which is why, to some degree, some would argue that some of the vendors that we interact with, like they don't have incentives to think like that per se, which is, whether it's on a national scale or at least a health system scale, like that's our job to do that. And that's what we try to do, because otherwise, unfortunately, there's no way to kind of fragment it in a way that doesn't then add pain points to someone else.
Yeah, I absolutely. I mean, I think that notion of like system level thinking, or, really thinking contextually about all the different decision points, I can imagine on the one hand helps you to break out of your assumption about what the other point, what the end point is. I can imagine on the other hand, that would result in cognitive overload. It's so hard to think of everything, everyone all at once, right? Okay, so moving on. I mean, as we talked about, there's an incredible wealth of data, wonderful development on many technological fronts, which opens up just, opportunities all around the industry. So how do you think about deciding which innovations are worth pursuing? Are there any general criteria or metrics that you apply when you think about exploring versus, putting resources behind a decision? And do you have any sort of standards that every innovation has to meet?
I'm going to go first, so then Yvonne has to clean up. And it's kind of an extension of what I was just saying, which is the reality is we think of the holistic experience, whether it be the patient or the clinician, as we think of a new innovation, saying, what will the experience net be? And usually then we also do a really frank conversation of what are the user needs? Because very often we can kind of get pushed into doing innovation by a new technology, sort of the classic sort of dog wagging the tail. And so we are pretty explicit about saying, okay, what exactly does this user need? And then ultimately, there are a lot of solutions out there that we either build, borrow, buy, whatever it may be. But even if it's like we can afford it, right? Even if the reality is maybe it has an ROI that's in the positive. Ultimately, that's not the only factor in making the determination, which is ultimately what you have to do. Is the juice worth the squeeze? It's really thinking of also the organizational effort. How much we can only do so many things, right? And you can kind of imagine the parts that have to move to make it happen, the change management, all those kind of like less quantifiable things that as leaders and decision makers, you're very aware of. That's what we really look at. And we have to think about essentially as much should we do this rather than only can we do it. And that's the explicit criteria. So we're often kind of very quickly early on saying like, what will the impact be? And we haven't mapped out the experience, right? So if it's a digital experience, right, where is this on the journey? Is the thing that it's trying to solve really something that we've heard from our users, whoever our stakeholders, which is usually patients and clinicians? Have they really asked for this, or are we pushing something on them because we think it's good or even evidence-based sometimes, but they don't want it? We have to be very frank about those things. And then ultimately think about, well, how hard will it be to do for the organization and not only do, but maintain? Those are the criteria we're often kind of in the back of our heads running through before we decide to even really investigate, let alone purchase or develop new solutions and innovations.
So just maybe to frame this slightly different, I think we're a way to start answering this question is not necessarily whether or not new technologies that vendors push are the best in what they do, but what's their translational innovation value. So to what extent that they can actually translate or to what extent we can take these leading edge technologies, and these could be new AI models or predictive analytic techniques or sensors and patient monitoring devices, to what extent we can take these new technologies and absorb them effectively into the day-to-day practices of real healthcare workers and organizations, because these are very idiosyncratic and dynamic. And ultimately, they will make or break these the success of these new innovations.
I guess I would say from my worldview in radiology department, in the imaging world, we just kind of thought about strategic goals and kind of gets to what you are questioning, how do you decide what to work on? Because there's so much, actually. And I think that one thing, it's a little bit of a focused answer, right? But one thing practical is how can you leverage your group or your organization's strengths and skills that define you as a group uniquely sometimes, right? Or compared with other groups that are out there that are doing great work also, maybe, is this work something that could be done by hundreds of groups out there, or is it really something that your group has special expertise in? And not just leveraging your own group, but leveraging the collaborations that can form between industry, between schools, like within NYU, for example. And what are those relationships where something really special can come out of it? For example, we're working with ODED on, the future of work and radiologists and how they interact with AI. It wouldn't be possible. I mean, maybe we'd want to do that, but it wouldn't be possible to work on that without someone like ODED to partner, right? And then finally, I saved it for last, but maybe it's most important. I think at NYU, I'm gonna generalize to the institution, but certainly in my department, we're bold, right? Think big, think bold, think paradigm shifting. what can really, make a really big impact if you were able to succeed. And obviously, we have to then try to realize it. And it's not to say that we don't do any work that's incremental, or that incremental work is sometimes critical to get it to the next step, to get it implemented, to get it out there. But I think, at least for us, it's exciting to think boldly.
I guess I'm cleaning up on this one. Oh, hold on.
We hear you.
We hear you. Yeah.
You're good.
Yeah, sorry. Can you all hear me? I had a little technical glitch there. So yeah, it's a question of, I guess, governance, right? Of like, okay, well, you have an idea, and how do you know which ideas are worth pursuing and which ones aren't worth pursuing? I actually have two answers to that. One is, how can you make it cheaper to like build models in the first place, right? And if you can make it very cheap, right, then you don't even really have to have this conversation around, well, is this model worth building or not? And that's something that our group is sort of one of our major objectives in the next year is, how can we go from a 6-month build to a 2-week build, right? In terms of building models, just so that people can see, right? If they have an idea, right, you can quickly get a baseline and say, okay, yeah, this is an easy problem, or this is a hard problem that's going to require a lot more work. But after you do that, I think like any other thing, it's thinking through the entire life cycle of what that product or idea is what's going to happen to it. So, one is, okay, you build the model. Well, do you have a way of actually deploying it, right, where you want to deploy it? And so that might be in the electronic health record or other places. And if that pathway is not clear, then that's a risk, because now you could build something, but it's not actually useful. And then once you've built it, right, who's the users? Who are the people that are going to use it? And so, there's both top-down and bottom-up approaches, right? So there's top-down approaches where, it's really a core set of users, and those are the only people that you have to educate. And that makes it a lot easier. So for example, there's a deterioration model, right, that's running at NYU, and the users are rapid response team nurses, right? And so there's a very small group of people who understand the technology, use it, and can diffuse their knowledge to the rest of the organization. Whereas if you have other technologies that require a bottom-up approach where like you have to train everybody, right? Those can be quite difficult, right? And what we've found in our own work is that even when we have a model that could be useful, when we try to train everybody, the actual adoption is actually pretty low. And it's going to take more than just one conversation of saying, hey, look, we have something really shiny and awesome, right? That might be useful. And so that's another piece, right? Is how do you actually get it to people? The next piece is how are you going to evaluate it, right? So if we don't have a plan around how we can evaluate something, then, it's kind of a no-go, because I could build it, people could use it, but if I can't actually measure anything downstream, then that's a risk and something that I have to pose to our governance committee to say, look, I could build it, but we can't actually measure it. So is this still something that you guys, would like to do? And then finally is this, idea of maintenance, right, downstream. So I could build something, right, but if it's going to take tons of resources to maintain over time, or there's something about it, right, that requires ongoing support and ongoing looking at it all the time, then that's a risk too, because this means that even when the project is done and I'm seeing the benefits, right, I still have to think about the resources I'm putting in later to sort of keep it going and to keep it up to date. So that's kind of how I like to lay it out, in terms of the projects that we take on, laying it out in those sort of specific dimensions, and then presenting it to my governance groups and my leadership groups, say, hey, here are the risks. What do you think? And depending on the impact and what, how important something is, people are willing to take risks in each of those domains because they feel like it's just that important to do so.
It sounds like you're saying it's about aligning the right set of potential upsides with the relative risk in light of cost in some sort of sense.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess conversely, are there things that you think are missing from your innovation portfolio, or things you wish you could do that you can't yet? And if so, what are the things that are holding those possibilities back? Is it cost, implementation issues, difficulty getting people on side? What are the things that are holding back the things you wish you could do?
So I'll try to take that. And as a general answer, I think something that's still missing very much definitely from AI models, and Yin can talk more about this, is this notion of scalability and transferability across institutions. AI models can be very good at doing some things in a very controlled environment, and may be terrible at transferring across from one place to another, so from one population to another, or from one hospital to another. So an AI model can work well in one institution, but not in another, and not just because the patient population is different, but because the users of these models may have different levels of expertise. So things like specialized versus generalist practitioners in a certain medical field, or the existence of different organizational structures. So to expand on the example that Yin gave of adverse events model, when Yin's team developed this model, they assigned ownership to a team of clinical alert nurses, which is something that exists at NYU Medical Center, and this team facilitates coordination between different nurses and attending physicians and respiratory therapists in this case, and other roles. And this team can use the model to prioritize patients and identify who can benefit from ICU transfer. But you take this model to a different institution, even in the same city, same population, but just a different hospital that does not have a clinical alert team, which is the case for many hospitals. And it requires a remapping of the workflows and assigning responsibilities to other people who are not part of the original implementation. So going back to your question about things that we would have liked to have and things we should not have. So you should really assess the usefulness of a tool or technology, in this case, an AI model, to the roles and responsibilities and the organizational structure of the recipient organization. And this is a hard problem, because some things just don't scale.
Yeah.
And this is an example.
Maybe I'm an optimist, but I feel like it's just an opportunity, where we're at a great almost inflection point where some of the technology is there, and there's so many things actually that we wish we could do, that we want to do, diagnoses that we can't even make well now until the disease is very, very far along. So I feel like, yeah, there are many things we wish we could do, but now is the moment almost for it. And I think there's so many opportunities if you're talking about machine learning, which I know this conference is much broader than that alone, but interacting modalities within imaging, MRI, ultrasound, kind of fusing some of our technologies and information that we can get, different complementary information we get from different types of modalities. Can we determine what data to actually acquire? What's the important data to acquire? So there's a lot of ways that we can use new technologies and kind of rethink, reinvent medicine. But I do think, like, the challenges, I guess, we touched on them already. implementation. It's like any other innovation. There's this valley of death that people talk about between R&D and getting it, out there to the customers. So it's got to be an iterative process, like Yin kind of alluded to, with feedback from the users as to how it's going.
It looks like Melissa wants to jump in with a question.
Yeah, for some reason, given my role, I don't get to put anything in the Q&A, and I've just been dying to ask you this question, so I hope it's okay if I jump in and ask a question. I once wrote a case on Given Imaging developing the camera pill, and I thought it's such a cool story about how they developed the camera pill, and it went through clinical trials and got approved for like the colon and the small intestine. And I thought the great news for me for this is that by the time I was old enough that I thought by the time I was old enough where my doctor was going to say I had to have a colonoscopy, that I wouldn't have to have a traditional colonoscopy. I could just take the camera pill. But lo and behold, this is like 20 years later, still very difficult to get a camera pill. And, my doctor did not recommend it. And that made me think really long and hard about the barriers to innovation in healthcare, because in addition to all the traditional barriers that we have in every other field, in healthcare, you have some extra barriers, right? You have, on top of technology risk, which everyone has in every field, you have this liability risk, right? So like doctors are also managing, they know that even if they use a poor technology, but they're using what's considered, standard of care, that they won't be in trouble personally for it. So that's going to make them reluctant to adopt. With the camera pill, there were some switching costs, like you could have an investment already in machinery that does endoscopes. But there's also the issue that in most categories of technology, we expect improvement through use. Like, the first electric vehicle was terrible compared to regular cars, but we got better at it over time. But I think in healthcare, we almost expect the technology to be perfected before it comes into use. So I wondered, is there any way to overcome this? Because it seems like there are a lot of factors here that would bias us towards extreme risk aversion in innovation in healthcare that could actually prevent some good technologies from emerging.
Agree. That's the challenge. And I think that's why, I guess those two words like innovation and healthcare, right? Some people joke about how they kind of don't go together all the time. There are additional barriers. It's true, I think. I don't know what the answers are to overcoming them. I don't know if Devin, you've thought more about that.
I mean, yeah. So, yeah, all true. That being said, there's a lot of innovation and a lot of experimentation happening. And there is this slow but methodical process. Using your camera pill as an example, 20 years later, it's not in extensive use because actually it failed the test of being valuable enough. It's not because it didn't get experimented with. I mean, I've known GI guys who've used it for a decade or more. But ultimately, to use that very specific example, it's like great technology, does all those cool things, but you can't cut a polyp out with it. So why go through the two-step process of putting in the camera pill first, finding a problem, and then having to do endoscopy, colonoscopy afterwards? Ultimately, it's just, people are like, I'm going to have to do two procedures half the time. And so just all the pieces didn't come together. So there was a lot of experimentation happening. Experimentation does happen. It can happen at big academic medical centers. That's one place, through researchers and innovative clinicians who can kind of push things ahead. There are certain health systems that are kind of just known for kind of pushing the envelope more than others. So I think, yes, as an industry, we're slow, but that doesn't mean there isn't a fair amount of experimentation happening. Our lab, we do a lot of experimentation. We just are more careful about it. And I think, the sort of retrospectoscope, as people like to say, of like, oh, well, why didn't this make it and why didn't that make it? There were a lot of factors. I think that the reality is, yes, there's room to improve to make us more agile, more flexible, but I'm not so sure if there's not substantial room for experimentation currently. And it's just slower.
So actually, that's a wonderful transition. Thank you, Melissa. So we have about 15 minutes left in the panel. I know our panelists have been amazing at jumping in already in the Q&A and responding to some questions, but now is the time that we're going to open up our conversation to any audience questions. So feel free to type into the Q&A and we can discuss them together. It looks like Samin Lee has a question. How are you making your innovations user-friendly and cost-effective? So users such as general population, patient, healthcare educators, nurses, and so on.
I mean, go ahead, Odin.
No. You do.
Well, one thing I can speak for our organization. One of the things we do to make things more cost-effective is, one was we try not to develop new things ourselves if something already exists. So sort of slightly modifying an existing thing is usually far more cost effective for everyone involved, both in literally costs, but also in sort of getting used to the new system or whatnot. And there's trade-offs there. And similarly, like we, for example, use an enterprise electronic health record, which, people have very strong opinions on all sides for. But one of the things it does is reduce this switching costs. And again, the getting used to new things cost. So for example, in our world, in our digital health world, I can use the remote monitoring space as an exemplar, right? So there's all these new sensors in people's homes. We could invest and sort of find the best of breed, the best user experience, the best for each of those things. But the overall cost actually for both the work and literally the physical cost in this case would be much higher than taking a much slower moving car. So we're using the kind of like lower model that doesn't have all the bells and whistles, but ultimately does a couple key things in a relatively, not dramatically different way than people were used to doing it before, which is very frustrating for certain audiences. But from that question, which is well asked, sort of like, how do you keep things cost efficient? And in my mind, that includes more than money. That's how we often do it. And it kind of ties into the question we were just talking about before this as well.
Yeah, it sounds like what are sort of the adjacent practices and what can we tack on such to bridge the barriers to adoption that might be behavioral, that not just like what's the literal price. Switching costs, of course, are a much more comprehensive and dynamic construct than just a price tag. That's a great point.
Yes, the direct cost is usually minuscule compared to cost associated with the lost time, lost productivity, and just things that are not necessarily monetary, like patients stopping to use the thing or do not even begin to do that. And then there's a cost of reintroducing them into it. So really the cost should be taken at a far broader perspective.
If I may as well, the user-friendly part of Sumin's question, I think that, Devin mentioned where healthcare tends to be a little bit slower, innovation's happening, but there's some additional checks and balances, right, that you kind of have to go through to get to the point where it's actually implemented and out there or popular even. But as a result, in some ways, we can learn from industry where someone mentioned the electric car, right? Or apps. So obviously medicine didn't have the first app, but our patients, the vast majority of them use our online app now. I mean, I'm a patient as well as a physician, right? So it is super useful. I love it, to manage my appointments, manage my kids' appointments, my mom's lab results. All of that is, so in some ways we can learn, I think, in terms of user friendliness from what we see happening in other domains in other industry sectors.
Yeah, it's almost, there's sort of the myth of the first mover advantage. And I think, Yvonne, what you're pointing out is sometimes it's you can benefit from the innovation from others, and it's maybe good to not be first, because then you can figure out how to bridge and how to actually tackle this hairy concept of user friendliness, which is fascinating. So another question from Linda Huber. So I heard some really strong themes of innovation hinging on organization support, understanding, change. I'd be curious to hear about the panelists' thoughts on the most pressing systemic changes in healthcare. So thinking about the crisis of healthcare staffing right now that are needed to enable technological innovation.
So I could start. I mean, I think the data, who has the data? Where is it? Are you allowed to use it? Who has access to it? Could you build derivative products from it? And who owns it? And that's always been, sort of, healthcare data is is considered very sacred, right? It's not our data really, hospitals' data necessarily, it's our patients' data, right? And that's always been sort of, sort of a slower block for innovation. It's not like you can just necessarily download a data set and start doing things with it, though there are, healthcare data sets like that today. But whether, those data sets are applicable, right, in an actual hospital and other things and models, will they work in hospitals? Those are all scientific questions, right, that have to be answered. I think the second piece is better integration, right? So how do we have the right hooks, right, so that everything happens in a seamless way for our clinicians? So, one day you can imagine you go see your primary care provider and maybe there's 20 AI models that are doing all kinds of things on your data, right, that are helping to help guide your care. Well, how do we encapsulate all that in one place? So the provider's not going to 20 different systems, right, to check things out, right, to see how things are going. And I think integration is a really strong, sort of, how do vendors and other people make this process easier, right, so that we can do this? And the third is the right data feed so that we can do real world evidence type of validations, right? So does every innovation have to be like, well, we did a randomized controlled trial, it took us 6 months, we have these results, and then we're done? Maybe there's other pathways, and the FDA is working on this, right, where maybe over time, right, you can see, oh yeah, this innovation is continuing to have the intended effect, right? That this evidence that this real world evidence we've produced is showing us, right, that this is useful, right? And now we can, have something that's beyond just an RCT and something else that's acceptable, right, that gets things to market quicker, right, that demonstrates, sort of technical innovations. So in my world, that's kind of, what I think about the AI space in terms of like the data, the integration, and then finally the evaluation and sort of ongoing evaluation as well.
And I can think of another way to sort of think about data, which I think is really essential and is really the revolution that we have now in healthcare, is to think about it as a pipeline that we need to make a better information fusion pipeline that's workflow aware of how data is being absorbed and acted on. So if you can think about all the way from data acquisition, and this takes place through increasingly diverse sensors, so like home-based devices and wearables, and there'll be more and more of this over time, including injectable things, and there are lots of sensors that are in the pipeline and will eventually just spit out a lot of data, and all of this data will have to go into a place where it is analyzed and then translated into clinical insights and support clinical decisions. So using things like new AI models and so on, the things that Yin talked about. So I think the biggest challenge in this information fusion is how do you package all of this information? Because at the end of the pipeline, there'll be a clinician in front of a patient. So how do you package all of this information in a way that's digestible to a generally overworked clinician or teams of clinicians, This is a challenge that really needs a lot of innovation, and there's sort of an arms race, because more and more sensors and more AI models are created that spit out more and more insights. And again, at the end, there's a bottleneck of a patient and clinicians, and we need to be better at handling this handover and work.
If I might push on this data point a little bit. So I'm thinking, data is not, in the healthcare field in particular, is not randomly distributed within a population. And, different hospitals may have different data sets that reflect their local population. So, the data on heart attacks in New York City will look very different than the data on heart attacks in Atlanta, Georgia, right? And so the consequence of that, I can imagine, is that you can't share your data nationally or globally, or, even, from the Northeast versus the West Coast. And maybe even in those cases, you still have regional effects that reflect local population health dynamics. So if you're training AI on local data, then presumably you get local predictions and local insights. Do you think that's helpful? Do you think that's hurtful? And maybe sort of my tack on question to that is, how important is understandability and the lack of opacity in some of these tools in explaining, or being able to be unpacked in how, different variables are actually combined in the predictions about, or in the sort of insights or diagnostic insights within the data, in light of the fact that we don't have randomly distributed health outcomes in this country? Sorry, that's more of a comment question.
Yes.
But I think definitely the first part, I think Ian has, we talked a lot about that, and I'm sure he has interesting things to say about that.
Yeah, so the answer to your first question, right, are local models better than global models? The answer is it depends. Well, first of all, it's a technical question, right? Like, we don't actually know, right? Is a global model built across a huge population, right, better than a local model built to a local population? And that's a scientific question where we don't really know what the right answer is, right? Because as you're saying, right, there's local variations, right, which a global model is not going to be able to capture, right? The second answer is a local model might be worse, right, if you're perpetuating a bad practice, right? So imagine you have a hospital that's just not that great, right, at treating sepsis or Clostridium difficile or something, right? And you build a model on that data. Well, now maybe you're just perpetuating, the bad practice, right? Whereas maybe what you should do is to find a place that's doing it well, right, and then bring that to another place that's doing it not well, right? But it's more than just bringing the AI model, because you have to bring the workflow too, and sometimes you have to bring the culture as well. Right. So maybe that second side is really awesome because they just have a really good culture where, like, people are thinking about this all the time. So it's not just the providers, it's the nurses, it's the entire care team. Right. And is that culture transferable to another place that's a community hospital, might has less resources and other things? Right. And these are the scientific questions that, the team here with Oded and Yvonne and Devin, that we're trying to answer. Right, is like, okay, what do you do in these situations? How do you take the success from one location and transfer that, to success in another place? So we'll find the answer to those, I think, through this process. And I think your second question, I can't even remember what your second question was.
Opacity, and how important, in light of all of this, how important is it to be able to interrogate and understand the AI models and what's driving particular predictions or conclusions?
And I'll say 2 sentences and then other people can respond, or probably more than 2 sentences. So the FDA has something to say about this, right? If you can show the outputs out of the machine learning model, the FDA does not consider it a medical device, and you do not have to get approval, right? And what that means is that you can see the outputs, you can see the things that are contributing to the model. And that's really important, right? Because sometimes people put in a blood pressure for a heart rate or a heart rate for blood pressure. The model fires. It's good for the clinician to see that and be like, okay, that's wrong. That's not real, right? And if you don't have that insight, you're out of luck. On the flip side, for models that are opaque, right, those do require FDA approval, right? So in the same way that we can give drug products like lithium to, people that have psychiatric issues, and we don't exactly understand how it works, we think it, stabilizes membranes or whatever, right? The FDA approves it for that application. And so we can imagine a world in the future where, look, the FDA regulatory said that this is okay to use in this context. And so I don't really have to know exactly how it works. All I have to know is that the FDA has approved in this context. And then that gives me confidence that I can use it for taking care of patients in a way that's not going to be detrimental for them.
If I could just add one comment to Ian's first comments about perpetuating, local versus global models, and the possibility of perpetuating bad practices. Just to echo that, I think there's also the possibility of perpetuating healthcare biases, right? That might be inherent in a local distribution. So if you're from Atlanta and you step off a plane in JFK and you end up at the hospital for some reason, like, do I run the Atlanta model on you, or do I run the local model on you? So, somehow I think obviously bias is something that's important, and also can be helped by some level of explainability, or it can help people see bias if there's some level of explainability.
Very interesting. Thank you all. And thank you all so much for your time. We are at 1:45. I can't believe we've been talking for an hour. This has flown by. I wish the conversation could continue. Oded, Yvonne, Yin, Devin, thank you. I can't wait to watch back this recording and take furious notes on all the things you said. So with that, I will turn it over to Melissa. And thanks again for this fascinating panel.
And Calvin, thank you for doing such a great job moderating. You're just for speakers.
Thank you for having us.
And also, we should say
thanks.
thank you to Batya Weisenfeld for organizing also this incredible panel. How fortunate we are that she knew all of you and that you would have so many wonderful things to say. I think we could have easily talked for several more hours. So thank you so much again for coming.